In a world shaped by digital electromobility, where none of the legal rules from 50 years ago are effective anymore, in reality, all of us lawyers, experienced or not, are in uncharted territory.
Hello to everyone from the Istanbul School. Dear viewers, this week our guest is attorney Selma Karaduman. Welcome, Miss Selma.
Fatma, glad to be.
How are you?
Thank you. How are you?
Thank you very much. Miss Selma, as a legal professional, how do you view the relationship between law and philosophy? I know I jumped right into a tough topic.
Not at all. On the contrary, you started with a topic I really love. First of all, I'm very happy to be here, to be talking with a businesswoman who knows philosophy, and to be surrounded by books. I would also like to remember with respect the late distinguished Professor Vecti Errol, my professor of philosophy of law. In my opinion, growing up with the philosophy of law has a significant impact on how lawyers view the law and on the creation of law itself. So, I think philosophy is a valuable backyard for all lawyers. I truly believe that philosophy is very important. I once read an article by a software developer named Mark Pesk. He says, and I really liked this, in order to create a world, it is necessary to create a worldview as well, he says. That's a statement I strongly agree with. And in the era we're living in, we're stepping into a green, resilient, and digital age. We're about to enter an era of electromobility where blockchain is being discussed. In other words, a time our grandparents could never have imagined living in, and we are the generation witnessing this age. I have to admit, I think we're very lucky. Because, we serve as a bridge between generations, and I believe we are the last generation to fully witness that unwritten, non-digitally transferred anthropological memory. So, this is very exciting, but at the same time, it's also an area that places a lot of responsibility on us. Therefore, based on Peskin's statement that the creation of a world necessarily requires the creation of a worldview, we are actually led to philosophy. Because as we create this world, including the fundamental rules, we will also be building a new legal system. And here, lawyers have always played important roles in every era of Renaissance and Enlightenment. And I believe that all of humanity is on the verge of entering a new age of enlightenment. Therefore, I think that philosophy should be the first backyard that lawyers turn to in this context.
There's also the issue of morality alongside this. We talk about law and philosophy, but should the priority be given to law or to morality?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, in the relationship between law and morality, the society's perspective on life and its social preconceptions play a very important role. Because, actually, moral concepts change from society to society and from era to era. But there are also universal moral rules that never change. For example, you shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall not covet what belongs to others, and so on. So, in these areas, philosophy gives us the opportunity to rethink, to question again, and to objectively keep what is good and discard what is bad. I call this the expulsion of dross. And in regulation, regulatory bodies should actually benefit a lot from philosophy in this sense, especially as they try to keep up with the pace of life.
I was just about to talk about the issue of social justice, individual rights, public rights. You call these competing rights in law, don't you? That's how I know it. How do you see the relationship between these competing rights?
That's a very good question. Well, when we talk about competing rights, I think it's impossible not to mention Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract. Rousseau, in his social contract theory, basically says that an individual cannot fully develop or sustain their abilities alone. Only when these abilities are combined with those of other individuals can sustainable protection be achieved. He argues that a society should be created in such a way that, while the society itself protects the life and property of the individual, when the individual gives up these rights, no one should actually suffer a loss of rights, because all other individuals are also giving up those same rights. That's how we can summarize it. Therefore, when it comes to competing rights here, if the individual is convinced and assured that the system of public freedoms, which begins where their own personal freedom ends, is actually a system that also protects their own freedom, then I believe these competing rights can turn into rights that unite and join forces together. Of course, if we continue here with Rousseau's terminology, the individual has a citizen identity, a civic identity. We see that they are referred to with three different concepts, including as a subject. When looking at it as a unity and a whole, Rousseau defines the individual as the people. At the same time, when he looks at the individual as a rebellious element demanding their individual rights, as the rebellious element of the state, he calls them a citizen, but when it comes to the side that follows the rules and obeys, he defines them as a subject. These are three definitions that I really like, and I actually believe that, whether in sociology or law, when talking about the individual, we should always remember and keep in mind the overlapping and differing aspects of the individual's identity as a citizen, as a member of the people, and as a subject.
Philosophy as the backyard of law is truly a beautiful definition. How do you personally benefit from it? For example, let me put it this way. How do you benefit from it in your own work?
Now, when I say that I often benefit a lot from literature and philosophy, people tend to see this as a kind of romantic statement. At the same time, as a businesswoman who takes her work very seriously, I want to emphasize that benefiting from philosophy and literature is not romantic at all. In fact, it's actually very rational. It's just as romantic as it is rational at the same time. Karaduman Law Office has been around for a very long time. We're entering our 15th year. I have been working mainly in contract law consulting for many years, and in any project or contract, I represent one of the parties, Ms. Fatma. But when you provide this representation, if you only protect your own party, you can actually end up harming the very party you represent. I believe that a good contract lawyer should not just protect their client, but rather the client's project, their business, and whatever the common interest is in that context. And of course, I draw on philosophy here as well. I can't presume to remind a distinguished philosopher like you of Kant's essay on perpetual peace, but perhaps it could serve as a reminder for our viewers. In his essay on perpetual peace, Kant says that only a peace with no hidden agenda, with no ulterior motive for future war, can be considered a true peace. It's a definition that I personally like very much. In contract law, the idea that both parties truly fulfill all the promises they make to each other in the contract, that they are sincere, and that they have no hidden agendas, matches exactly with Kant's definition in his essay on perpetual peace. And again, Kant says, one must never lie if there is to be true peace. I also think the sincerity of the parties in their promises here is very important. So, the fact that a definition written centuries ago still remains relevant today is, in my opinion, an important sign of how timeless both law and philosophy are.
So, we're talking about individual rights, right? How can we know what our individual rights are? How do you see this? I mean, as an ordinary citizen, in order to protect a right, you need to know what it is. If I have rights that I don't know about, how can I understand them, learn about them, and benefit from them?
First of all, I think citizenship is one of the highest rights. Back in my day, in middle school, there was a citizenship class. I don't know if it still exists, but I think it's very important because, as I said, citizenship awareness is an element where your primary rights are found, and in this sense, knowing your rights is very important. But considering that we can't always look things up in a book or on the internet, I can answer your question with a very simple and, in my opinion, helpful definition. Because, in fact, the law protects exactly what an average, reasonable, and sensible person would think about an issue, nothing more, nothing less. It's intuitive and instinctive, because there is a common agreement on the answer to a question. A social consensus. As you can appreciate, the jury system abroad also actually evaluates the outcome of a trial based on the average person's average response. So, the reflex of the average person is very important. Maybe it doesn't offer very sophisticated solutions, but it also doesn't steer us away from the basic ones. In this sense, I think it's an important criterion. Of course, it's not enough to rely solely on instinct and intuition. I also think it's beneficial to read the parts of the laws, especially constitutional law, that deal with fundamental rights concerning basic human issues.
So, you mentioned individual rights. As an experienced lawyer, what advice would you give to young legal professionals? There are so many lawyers. There are so many law schools. What do you think about this? In general, what advice would you give to legal professionals?
First of all, I'd like to start by hoping that our young colleagues are doing a job they truly love. Because I believe that people who do what they love never get tired. At the same time, I think it's very important for them to constantly renew themselves and refresh their knowledge. Because someone once asked a Sufi, "What do you know best?" And he replied, "I know my limits." The best part about learning something new is that it helps you develop the humility to recognize what you don't know. And after a certain number of years in your profession, I think this humility becomes very valuable. Because in my opinion, the most dangerous years are when you start to become experienced. Because at that point, it gives you a comfort zone. And especially in this era of transition we just talked about, where we're moving into a completely different world, one with digital and electric mobility, where none of the legal rules from 50 years ago are relevant anymore. In reality, all of us in the legal profession, whether experienced or not, are novices. If we can accept this, but in order to do so, we need a certain inner humility. At this point, I think having a curiosity to learn something new is extremely valuable. My humble advice to our young friends is to nurture their curiosity. Because when you nurture your curiosity, it will definitely guide you, like a navigation system, onto the right path. And it will definitely bring you together with other people who are curious about the same things. Sometimes these people become friends, and sometimes they become clients. Because you were curious about a topic before they were, and without even realizing it, you end up creating an ecosystem. So I especially want to emphasize the importance of nurturing your curiosity. I also believe that the greatest asset a lawyer can have is not seeing others as the other. Unfortunately, in this century, both in our country and around the world, polarization is widespread, and I think this division is a very serious problem. In this wonderful broadcast where we talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract, I believe that, far from polarization, a society can only come together hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, if its individuals do not see anyone as the other. And here, surrounded by this beautiful library, I can say that in order for an individual not to have an other, not to be alienated, they first need to read and understand what it means to be the other themselves. Therefore, I believe that reading from multiple sources and looking at things from different perspectives is extremely important. And so, reading and drawing nourishment from these different perspectives, intellectual nourishment, will definitely be reflected in the work, attitudes, and viewpoints of legal professionals. Because what we do is a job that deals with people. When it comes to choosing our clients, we have 3 criteria. They must earn their money legally and ethically, they must treat us with respect, and they must make their payments regularly. But apart from that, regardless of an individual's language, religion, race, outlook on life, or political views, you, as a lawyer, should see them as your client and treat them with equal distance. I think that's a very valuable quality. This perspective really enriches a lawyer. Because since you don't work with just one type of person, you can look at things from many different perspectives. Whenever I describe my profession and the work I do, I always call it tailor-made, Miss Fatma. So, I'm someone who tries to practice tailor-made lawyering. If you think of me like a tailor, instead of saying I only work with young women, imagine that you handle the needs of every member of a family. If you can respond in a way that covers the fashion expectations of an elderly person, a young woman, and also a mature woman, that means you have a very rich portfolio. I think this kind of richness is also important in law, and by the way, when we look at the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals, the whole world today is emphasizing the importance of inclusivity and diversity. Therefore, diversity and inclusivity don't just mean having a variety of people who think like us, but also being able to sit at the same table with those who think differently from us, as long as we can reach a common consensus on fundamental values. I think this is very important for a lawyer in the century we live in. I believe it's very important for us to embrace the richness of all the shared values in the world and reflect that in our work, our lives, and our relationships with others. Since my job is to solve problems, people say that, in a sense, we are fixers. But I actually think that our ability to be fixers, Our quickness and spontaneity in pulling out the right handkerchief, the silk handkerchief, from that bundle of precious, ancient, shared values, has a lot to do with how much we draw from this diversity.
Yes, you've said some very valuable things, Miss Selma. Truly, as a nation, we need to express our own essence by drawing from both the East and the West, just as Yahya Kemal and Tampiner have mentioned. We need to do this in every field, including the legal field. We truly thank you very much for your valuable comments.
Enjoyable conversation.
Same for us. Thanks much.
Be left out.
You viewers. This week, we talked about the relationship between law and philosophy with our guest, attorney Selma Karaduman. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.